Welcome, everybody, to episode 39 of the Ape and Bird NFT show. And we have a tremendously special guest today with us, Ben Roy, coming from Canada. Ben and I have actually never spoke. We've followed each other on Twitter for quite some time. I think we have a few mutual friends, and shout out to Friendly Jameson, who certainly vouches for Ben. But I always see Ben popping up. He has a pretty iconic squiggle on my Twitter feed. I reached out to Ben a couple of days ago and said, I got a crazy idea, and this might sound a little weird or odd, but would you like to do a podcast with me? Ben came back and said, let's do it. We're now here. Ben, welcome to the show, and nice to meet for the first time in person. Well,
Yeah,
virtually at least.
totally. Thanks so much for having me, Greg. I think a lot of what makes crypto really fun is this remote first kind of set of relationships that you form. So it's both weird and normal to be like, yeah, let's just do it.
Absolutely. So, give the listeners, Ben, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out there that already follow you, but you seem to do a lot of things in the space. You know, you're doing some things with art. You're always on Twitter Spaces. You've got your own blog. Give us your sort of your TLDR on what you do in Web3.
Yeah, totally. So I guess in short, I've been working around kind of the crypto scene for the last 4 years, since about 2019. At the moment, the way that I think about it is there's like three buckets of what I'm up to. So one is Accelerate Art, which is a nonprofit kind of focusing on digital art and mostly artists that work in crypto and Web3. And that's with Claire Silver. And we've been kind of settling on doing 4 physical events a year, along with some digital programming. So that's kind of part one. Part two is I'm quite an active angel investor in the space. And so I work with, I think it's about 12 projects now. And it's a range of like consumer products, like some art stuff, some AI, some gaming. But yeah, I just have been enjoying kind of working pretty closely with some founders across the space. And then number three is more of this media experimentation. So I'm writing a newsletter. I'm doing some Twitter Spaces stuff, potentially thinking about my own podcast. But yeah, it's been exciting just to be able to, have a vantage point where you're looking at a lot of different things at the same time. So it's chaotic, but it's fun. And yeah, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
Well, speaking of chaos, you actually have in your Twitter profile that, chaotic generalist. And I know that you've had a couple of tweets that have sort of cracked me up over the last couple of months where you sort of, I think you had like this trilemma tweet the other day where you said there was, you can pick two. And what was it? It was, do you remember off the top of your head?
Yeah, it's like you can work, you can sort of stay up to date with the industry, and you can look after your health. Pick two. And it's like you're exaggerating to make the point. Hopefully, some folks are able to be responsible, look after themselves, like still hustle and have some fun. But it's kind of making the point that the pace of crypto is so insane a lot of the time that, you can kind of bleed out along the edges if you're not careful, whether that's physical health, mental health, or you just don't get to keep up with things if you're focusing on yourself. So yeah, it's tricky. It's like very fun as an industry, but it's a lot for sure.
Absolutely. I want to loop back to some of the things you mentioned, sort of like accelerate art later in the show, because we're going to get into sort of market sentiment and just a few of the topics that have happened over the last week. But you mentioned that you came into the crypto space in 2019. For me, I came into the crypto space sort of mid 2020 in terms of buying my first investments with Bitcoin and Ethereum. But really, NFTs was the tsunami that sort of captured my attention and captured my imagination and sort of haven't come up for air since. But in 2019, what were you playing with most? Like, what were you one of the very early NFT collectors in 2019, or had you been playing around in DeFi? Like, what? How did you come into, I suppose, the space in that era?
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple things. The first thing I ever bought beyond Bitcoin and Ether was actually Decentraland in 2019. So I think I am like incidentally an early NFT person. Like there really was not a lot going on OpenSea at the time, and I don't even really want to pretend like it clicked that well for me early. It was more just I thought, oh, like this is interesting. I like Ready Player One. Like maybe these virtual worlds will be a thing. So I'll buy some land, and we're talking like a couple $100, right? So there's definitely the NFT side that interested me from early on, but more practically, it was the DeFi kind of wave where at the time you could kind of keep track of everything in crypto land. It was like, okay, there's Bitcoin development, there's Ether development, there's a few DeFi protocols, like some of the main ones. And there wasn't really much going on in NFT land. And so, yeah, I just felt like, some of my background is working in politics and international trade. So sort of the boring, like political background. And I just felt, okay, like maybe this is a new version of what finance could be. So yeah, onboarded mostly through that kind of financial lens, but then pretty quickly realized, like NFTs are just more fun, more my speed. Like I like the culture side of stuff more. And yeah, that's kind of a bit of the backstory.
I think it's a very interesting backstory that you are tending to lean into that sort of culture in the NFT side now, because I think when, with my own story, I came into NFTs, and then I think a lot of people that I know now after 2 or 3 years of relationships that were just in general crypto or in DeFi, they didn't really get NFTs, or they sort of fudded NFTs. They just weren't believers in it. But it's interesting just how everyone comes in from different vantage points. But I've got to say, since I've sort of come in via the NFT vertical, you then start to understand the crypto ethos a little bit more, and you start to go down various different rabbit holes. So always a fascinating time speaking to people about their journey into crypto. So Ben, how are we feeling about the general market sentiment? Obviously, we've had sort of the floors bleeding out since really sort of after that Blur mini pump in mid-February when the token dropped. We've seen a steady decline. Really, sort of sentiment's been pretty low overall over the last couple of months, at least on the projects that we've all sort of become accustomed to over the last couple of years. Gen Art, which you're obviously a big player in, has held up better, as to be expected, than PFP projects. But how are you feeling about sort of general market sentiment right now?
Yeah, I think obviously sentiment's pretty low. I think when you have Blur come in, you sort of speed run what probably would have happened in a long-term bear market, in that you bring a bunch of liquidity in, people are able to exit, guys like Mando and OSF being able to sell their apes like without any slippage. All of a sudden, you have a lot of these whales exiting, and so floors crash, and NFTs kind of drop, and sentiment kind of follows accordingly. Though at the same time, we've seen some other projects kind of pick up the slack, right? Like the Jack Butcher kind of universe has done very well. Meme Land and those guys have done very well. So it's kind of a bit of a mixed bag. It's more I think just a reckoning with like a lot of the euphoria that we had through 2021 and 2022, and realizing like, okay, well now you have to turn these things into real businesses or they kind of go bust, right? Minus, I suppose, the art for art's sake category, which I think in part, like you've mentioned already, is why some of those projects have held up, and some of the one-of-one market's been okay as well. But yeah, I think like broadly, while we're definitely in a lull compared to where we were, 18 months ago,
Oh,
I just prefer
I think we've
crypto when it's on the edge. I think, oh,
Sorry, just lost you there for half a second, Ben, but it'll be fine. This is the
oh,
great
good.
thing about Riverside. It records to my computer as well. So apologies for the listeners
Beautiful.
if you heard me interrupt Ben there. I just lost him on our end, but please continue, Ben. We're back.
Yeah, no worries. I was just saying, like, I think I prefer crypto when it's on the edge slightly and when sentiment isn't great, because it's kind of a forcing function for artists and creators and entrepreneurs to actually go do cool stuff, right? And most of the space has been pretty vacuous over the last 12 months. Sort of this like lingering kind of euphoria of, maybe like we can gamble and make money. And of course, there's like, that's always going to be a feature of crypto, but my sense is while sentiment is down, like in terms of like price, and people aren't really, making a huge amount of money anymore, I do see a lot of like builders, entrepreneurs, creatives, still really like jazzed with the industry, and they love blockchains, and being able to make digital art is cool. And so I don't know, I'm like the optimist, I think, at this point. We've been going down for a while. Who knows, like whether price keeps going down or not? It may very well do that. But the real builders are out there, and I think that's always kind of encouraging to me.
Yeah, I share the same sentiment. And, recently our podcast listeners would have heard over the last couple of weeks, I've started at a Web3 sort of investment DAO, and also co-working space here in Melbourne, Australia, Ben, called Upside DAO. And sort of we've made a couple of investments over the last 8 to 10 months. But, my job coming in is to sort of get this Web3 community hub humming. So I'm surrounded in a physical location 3 days a week by some incredible builders and devs that are just hacking away on all kinds of crazy stuff. And, the energy you get from that is quite good. And, I think there's always these two parallels running, right? There's people that are in the space like you and I that are actually sort of working towards the future of Web3. And then there's this sort of casino gambling side of things that really only takes full swing for the degenerates on the side or people that come in the bull run. So overall, as sort of an asset class and where we're going, I'm still incredibly bullish. It's just obviously the projects that we saw in an up only environment that you alluded to before in 21 and 22 have just continued to bleed. The bleeding hasn't stopped except for, things like Azuki and the captains and that you mentioned. So I think we share a pretty common theme there. So Mercedes-Benz, I don't know if you saw this news, Ben, but Mercedes-Benz has entered Web3, and it looks to me like they've done it in more of an authentic fashion or an organic fashion to the ethos of Web3. What is your take on it? Have you had a chance to sort of get across Mercedes?
Yeah, I took a look at this yesterday, actually, just kind of in the lead up, seeing that we would be chatting about it today. And I think usually the big critique for like big, normal Web 2, I mean, it's not really a Web 2 company, but just big brands that sort of existed pre crypto. The knock on them is they tend to come in, not really listen to the, quote unquote community, do something and just try and siphon money out of the markets effectively. And this, like what Mercedes is up to, is kind of one of the rare times that I've seen where you're thinking like, oh, maybe they actually could win here because they've taken the time. They're partnering with a meaningful artist and Fingerprint style and a good kind of community that's been around for a long time. They're speaking the language of the space with like a generative art drop. So I think like I would say cautiously optimistic. I'm kind of curious to see and follow along, but definitely like what you would want to see from a big brand coming in the space. Lots of like high cultural awareness, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like it's always this sort of balance, right, for brands where they're like, okay, do we try to target the Web3 audience and the NFT collectors, like people like yourself and I, Ben, that hopefully have a crossover or a brand affinity with Mercedes, but that pool of people is probably going to be quite small, and we know that the amount of active wallets just keeps shrinking and shrinking right now. Or do you try to roll up your sleeves and almost go like Gary V style, where he tried to onboard his whole community into like setting up, MetaMask and get like brand new people in there. But we know how much difficulty that comes with in terms of and sort of how much manpower and woman power that you need to educate a Web2 consumer base into like setting up a wallet and all the security problems that you come with. So I like what Mercedes is doing. I feel like it's the best way I could sort of sum it up is like dipping their toe in the water, trying to essentially get validation and a stamp of approval from the Web3 community to say, hey, we're doing some collaborations, we're sort of doing it quote unquote the right way, and then they can sort of expand out from there. So it's quite interesting. Actually, yesterday I was coming home on the train and I just on Twitter, and I'm not sure if you know this person, Ben, and I might, it's a female punk at Maxagrel 3701 on Twitter. So he or she, I have no idea, is actually on the Mercedes-Benz NXT team. So I had a little bit of a DM interaction. So there's a team of 4. So again, I asked this person whether I could mention their name on the show, and they said that was fine. So yeah, I'm part of the 4-person team running it, and yeah, we've got a dedicated entity for Mercedes-Benz. So who knows? Maybe we'll get this person on the show to tell us a little bit more about Mercedes plans coming up. But I always think it's interesting, right, to see brands like Mercedes and particularly luxury brands, dipping their toe in the water. Amazon, speaking of big brands, we've been teased an Amazon NFT marketplace for quite some time now. I think it was meant to launch in April, then it got pushed to May. We are now in June. Have you got any visibility on what's happening at Amazon?
Yeah, I don't have any kind of inside insight as to when they're going to drop their marketplace or not, but I do think I remain kind of cautiously optimistic on this one too. To this point, we've never really had a major player push NFTs in a meaningful way. Like Instagram was probably the closest we've gotten, and they essentially just ran a beta where certain artists were able to kind of mint their artwork for sale. But if Amazon is going to line up and really make a meaningful push here to create a marketplace, they have an amazing amount of connections, whether it's just in-house with even like their studios or more broadly. There's a lot of credibility there, right? And so I think, yeah, I'm like, it's something I'm watching for, but we have yet to see a major player like deliver something that other crypto folks cared about. So that more falls in that category of this is hoping to bring net new people in, as opposed to kind of this more crypto community oriented play that other kind of projects tend to go for. So I hope it works. I'm definitely like optimistic, but yeah, kind of TBD. We'll have to see.
Yeah, so the two comments I would make about the Amazon Marketplace, or three comments, is one, it sort of it felt when there was a little bit of a hype wave, obviously different times in terms of bull and bear, but we go back to remember when Coinbase was going to drop their NFT marketplace, and it was almost like, Coinbase is going to be the savior of every project, and it was announcement after announcement after announcement. There's obviously not as much hype because we're deep in this bear right now, but with the Amazon NFT marketplace, my assumption initially was that it was going to be really about sort of like more the Reddit style, or just they're over and doing their own thing. They're not going to be really incorporating anything that we would see sort of on a regular basis on crypto Twitter or whatnot. But that theory was actually debunked when I heard Justin Aversano on Overpriced JPEGs about 2 months ago, I think now. He actually alpha leaked to Carly Riley that he was approached by Amazon to be one of 15 artists that they were going to display art for on the marketplace. And he was giving his reasoning why he declined. And then like sort of Carly was sort of talking him off the ledge saying, are you sure you want to decline this opportunity? So they had this back and forwards, but TLDR on that is, I think they are going to have some artists and some projects that we are familiar with seeing on Blur and OpenSea and crypto Twitter on a daily basis that are going to be part of this launch. The other thing that I had heard is they're really going to use this as an experiment of tying physical goods with a digital NFT, right? And we all know that that can be really a compelling case for the blockchain moving forwards. And what better way or what better company to experiment than Amazon? So I'm excited for it as an experiment. I don't expect it to be, making waves in terms of pumping floors or anything of collections that you or I hold. But I think it's an interesting thing that's still coming down the pipe. So hopefully it's launched in the coming weeks.
Totally.
All right, let's move on to Otherside, the other deeds. There was an announcement earlier this week, a little bit of a teaser in classic Yuga Labs style, building anticipation, keeping that anticipation, giving you probably more questions than answers in the Yuga style communication that has worked so well for them over the last couple of years. What was your take on this, Ben? It seems like, we saw that video, I think around March 2022, where we saw like the Noun and World of Women and Cool Cats that were in sort of that Otherside promo video before the land drop. Now it seems like we're getting more teasers that maybe other PFP collections are going to be involved in beta testing around the Otherside game. Is that probably how you would frame it?
Yeah, I think, I look at Yuga and you see the biggest kind of company in the space, right? Like they've raised serious money. They have the earliest and, most consistent track record. If anyone is going to try and take a run at being kind of this decentralized Disney where everyone else can plug in, it's going to be them, right? And so short run, I'm kind of interested to see how they continue to expand Otherside from stuff like the Legends of Mara kind of mini game, expanding, through the Coda kind of universe, because it becomes almost like too much to keep track of. There's so many different characters and whatnot now. But if you look at it from the lens of, what would I do to try and build like a full-on decentralized Disney? This kind of starts to make sense, where you're trying to invite other IP into your world, you're building out other things in parallel. And so I don't know, I think my position as someone who follows it, but doesn't follow it super, super closely, is just you want to be rooting for these guys to win because they're representatives to the wider kind of universe of NFTs in general, right? And so it's just trying to hope that they deliver stuff, they move beyond just ultimately like minting additional NFTs and creating new experiences for people. So yeah, hopeful. I think like it's so hard just to ship meaningful games and experiences, that a lot of the time these things just get delayed, and it's 6 months later, it's 3 months later. So I'll be kind of waiting to see what they ship ultimately. But yeah, hopeful and kind of rooting for them from the sidelines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've mentioned on this show previously, like Steve, my regular co-host who I was talking to just before we came on air, he and I, dating back to sort of when some initial Moonbirds and Proof FUD started to appear, as sort of like we've always taken this sort of interesting stance where it's sort of like you've got Yuga on one end of the spectrum in terms of communication that's always had this like mystique about them, and sort of like just they're able to almost make an announcement yet still tease future anticipation. And then you got people like Kevin and Justin that just seem so genuine and authentic in their communication style that they're almost like telling everyone in the world what's in their brain, and often that can be perceived as FUD, and this is, then all of a sudden this project's out the door, or floors are tanking because they've said something that's quite honest, but they've sort of sucked the anticipation out. And so it's been an interesting, as someone that's been in both ecosystems over the last 2 years, it's been interesting to see the dynamics of communication style. And now you see the emergence of like Frank de Gods and Luca Netz and how they sort of communicate as well, trying to sort of keep the vibes up within the communities.
Yeah, I feel like each of these projects would just do well to kind of carve out their own lane at the end of the day. Like Yuga does its thing, right? Some people are supportive of that, some people are critics, but at the end of the day, like there's at least some consistency around what they're up to. I think Moonbirds has kind of struggled a bit on the communication side, and as they figure out their voice and their cadence and their pace, you're also rooting for them, right? Like if Kevin and the team aren't able to deliver something, I think Web3 has like bigger problems, so I'm hopeful and supportive that both of these teams, and I guess like obviously Luca and the Penguins, Frank and D-Gods and Utes, like it's just these are sort of our best entrepreneurs, right? And so it's a bit of a tricky thing in comparison to other areas of business, in the sense that you're constantly being audited by both critics and your fans and holders on a daily basis. But I do hope that they're able to just like form a path and make some stuff happen.
You mentioned Jack Butcher earlier. We've seen Opepen. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, Opepen on the show, but we've surpassed a 1 ETH floor now. Ben, did you get any Opepen? Do you like Opepen? Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Jack's. I think he's quite thoughtful on a lot of different things in the space. I personally have like a small position in checks and Opepen, just a couple of each. More from the perspective of like I just want to be rooting for people who are thoughtful builders. I think what's interesting to me is you have just a slightly different approach to old models that have existed previously in kind of NFTs, where it's not necessarily a new thing to create an open edition, or to have different artists participate in something, or to update metadata or whatever it is, but to wrap them all together and package them as a singular experience in the way that Jack has. I think it's just captivating, and it's clearly brought in kind of a new cohort of people for whom that's the first time they've been exposed to these sorts of models. I just think like Jack's one of the few people who has a serious platform, had a serious platform before crypto, who's committed to kind of consistently building in public and not kind of creating a mint and running away from it. And I think that really contributes to people's excitement here, where there's essentially like you're playing attention games and no matter what you're doing in crypto. And so to have like for Opepen specifically, like a consistent set of new art coming through, people have expectations constantly of what's going to happen. You've really captured both like the best of design and art in a public, industry, and also like playing attention games really well. And so I think who knows what happens with prices. I mean, it's just been quite hyped over the last little while. But I think when I look at it from like a long view over the next 12 months and beyond, like definitely bullish and interested to see what Jack gets up to.
I think it's such an important point, and something that, maybe creators don't think about often enough is that attention that you were talking about. And, you even see NFT statistics on Sam's Daily Proof podcast talk about, anticipation as the oxygen of the NFT space. And I think that's what Jack has done so brilliantly, as you alluded to, is to really map out and sort of keep those people's attention while he's experimenting and building in public. So shout out to the Opepen holders. I want to talk about Coldie, an OG's OG artist, for a second. About probably an hour ago, Coldie sold out a very affordable, I think it was 180 pieces, with a collaboration with a site called Click Create, I think it's called. I actually interviewed Coldie last week, so that's my next Cointelegraph article that will be out in about another week or so. But Do you hold any coldies, Ben? Or maybe it's a broader question I'd like to ask you is out of sort of some of these OG artists over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, the Josie Bellinis of the world, Trevor Jones, etc. What is your maybe most OG piece that you have of art in the bag? Oh, okay. So Ben's just dropped off. I think his internet has been a little
Could you
bit
just ask that last question again? I
bouncing
think we
around.
maybe just
So
missed each other
while
on
Ben
cutting out.
comes back, I think he has tried to text me in the chat. I do want to talk about a little bit of a rally with Nakamigos. So Nakamigos, we saw obviously run up, couldn't quite hit 1 ETH a few months ago, despite multiple attempts with Beeple's art and a lot of interest on crypto Twitter with Nakamigos. But we have seen a rally, Nakamigos nearly getting back to 0.5 ETH. I think they got down to 0.15, maybe 0.18. But we have seen a rally in Nakamigos. So shout out to the Nakamigos community. It has proved to be a little bit more stickier than I thought. I thought once it started to go below 0.2, it might have kept going south, but it has seen a rally. And we do have Ben back, which is awesome. I think Ben just had a couple of little internet troubles there. So Ben, I was just talking about Nakamigos having a little bit of a rally in the last week or so, which is great to see for their holders. But the question I wanted to ask you, and you may not have heard, was I was making reference to Coldy. Been doing an art spotlight series for Cointelegraph recently and really going down the rabbit hole on a number of OG artists. I did something with Def Beef that came out yesterday. My question to you, Ben, is maybe twofold. Now that you're back online, I'm going to actually throw a second question to you. Who are some of your favorite OG NFT artists, the people that were sort of around creating, crypto art and early NFT art in that sort of 2018, 19, 20 era? And do you have a specific NFT, an art NFT outside of your Chromie squiggle, because we know how passionate you are about the squiggles, that just, sort of resonates with you and that you most likely won't sell?
Yeah, great questions. I think, I guess a couple things just to respond to a bunch of what you've mentioned. I think on the Nakamigos side, part of it I wonder is like Ben.eth and that whole sort of exercise in publicly just taking people's ETH is probably contributing there a little bit, because I know he was sweeping that collection. On the Coldy stuff, I know Click Create has just been really cool so far, and I'm excited to follow what they're up to. I know that they, NorCal and Clutch have a lot of connections, and they're just going to do a lot of interesting things. And so it's unsurprising to me that they're able to land someone like Coldy. Interested to see how that drop went. I actually didn't have a chance to look today.
It's minted
yet.
out. Yeah,
Oh,
it's
did it?
minted
Okay,
out
very cool.
as of an hour ago. I was going to buy off public, but I just missed it. I must have missed it by like 20 minutes.
Got it. Well, good for them. No, I mean, like, you just love to see, different kind of approaches to marketplaces for real artists. And then, on the art side, I think like two answers come to mind. Xcopy might seem like the kind of cop out answer, in the sense that he's probably the most definitive like OG artist that exists. But I had a chance to do a show in 2021 with Accelerate Art, in partnership with Punk 4156, who's like quite a big Xcopy collector. And so we did a big virtual tour in a Crypto Voxels gallery. Claire and I were doing kind of some interviews with different artists. A big floor was dedicated to Xcopy's work. And I think off of that, we had essentially like an hour-long conversation about his work and his background, and working on Tumblr back in the day, and has been doing digital work for 10, 15 plus years. And I just think he embodies the spirit of the culture in a way that few other artists do. Of like, it's very intense, like you're getting wrecked all the time. There's a bit of a thread of nihilism in it all. There's kind of questions of meaning. I don't know. There's just like, there's a lot of resonance for why people, I think, like Xcopy, not just because he was around, but also because like he embodies a lot of the ethos of what crypto is. To answer the last question there, I think something that I really appreciate in terms of art that I've collected is some of early like Claire Silver work. Imprimatura is probably the one that I would point to. It's an open edition from actually 2021, but just I think really like captures Claire's style. in a really human way. And so I just think like she's kind of the X copy of AI art, if you will. It's maybe a bit of a flawed comparison, but she was, been working since 2018 and was one of these early folks working on things far before, a mid journey or a stable diffusion made it quite easy to do. So yeah, anyway, I've rambled on there, but those would be some of my answers.
I love those answers, and I'd love to take the conversation now into sort of like, as you mentioned, sort of the cultural aspect and the ethos of crypto and just in general, and sort of mentioning Xcopy and Claire, and those two are just fantastic artists. I really enjoyed just the stories, the origin stories of people that it wasn't necessarily about the money; it was about actually capturing the culture. And when I think about the conversation I had with Josie Bellini a couple of weeks ago, where she was essentially red pilled on sort of crypto and Bitcoin in general, and said like she was working at some TradFi company, and she was thinking like, I can't, as a poor person, I can't even dabble in these investments because I don't make credit invested requirements in the US, etc. Then started going to Bitcoin meetups and things like that in Chicago, and started making art and making flyers and posters, and then that leads to sort of doing this like crypto graffiti style art, and then that leads to sort of NFTs. And you think of Trevor Jones's story, sort of making art around like John McAfee and Vitalik back in the day, and sort of doing like physical gallery exhibitions, and then sort of spinning out NFTs. And it's just like a really, really fascinating rabbit hole to go down and sort of see how all of these things, like I always think about it as like you and I are having this conversation now, right? And we're talking about people that were experimenting only 3-4 years ago, and it feels like a lifetime ago. But I really do believe in my heart that like we're going to be having Netflix doco series in the coming decades that are going to be talking about these origin stories of the Claire Silvers, of the X copies, like this whole wave, and how this sort of like NFT thing started. And I think there's a massive cultural aspect that is so fascinating. And I think the question I put in the notes to you, Ben, that I'm going to throw to you, and maybe this is a little bit of hopium on my side, but I've felt it in my bones for a couple of years. So it'd be good to get your perspective. But ultimately, the crypto culture and sort of the ethos that you and I are speaking about, and you obviously are writing about in your blog, so we sort of share that common interest. Are we actually going to see that expand out? And the analogy I'll use is, in the late 80s and the early 90s, we saw sort of like a lot of hip hop and rap was underground, right? But then it infiltrated and it proliferated into mainstream culture. And it's still a permanent fixture, right? So do you think we'll see any sort of mass adoption of these type of like crypto culture or crypto art and things like that? Or do you think we're just going to remain in our own little bubble for a long time to come?
Yeah, I think my answer would be I hope so. I hope we're able to kind of have a broader impact. There's a quote that I'm not actually entirely sure who to attribute to, but it's this idea that every good subculture becomes mainstream culture. Like you see it in fashion trends, you see it in music, you see it in a lot of different things, right? And I think the hope for a lot of people here, quote unquote, here in crypto, is that you do something that's meaningful enough that it has like shockwaves into the mainstream. I think we start to see, small bits and pieces of that with something like, squiggles being on a jersey for a soccer team, or just like a few of the different NFT IP experiments that we've kind of seen so far, kind of becoming a little bit more mainstream, but we're still pretty much a subculture in my opinion. Like we're still off to the side. And so I think
Yeah.
like there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but my sense is, in another cycle in 2-3 years, is there a case that a small, minority of what we consider crypto culture, is there a case that like bleeds into mainstream culture? For sure. And I hope so. It really comes down to a power law thing where I think very few items or aesthetics or artists or people will probably embody that. But I do think, yeah, like you've said, maybe we'll end up seeing like a documentary series or something, because it's like a new moment in time. It's a new moment in art history at some level, right? Where you're able to create and own items on the internet. And that wasn't a thing before. And I think that alone makes it interesting.
I think that's an amazing take. considering you've been in this thing since 2019, and you saw what crypto looked like and what crypto Twitter looked like, sort of really before NFTs were the talk of the town. I mean, obviously punks existed and autoglyphs and things like that, like the early projects. But I did a talk last year, Ben, at a conference here in Australia, and it was based around sort of a phrase that I came up with, or sort of an analogy that I come up with. So this is really talking about the subculture again, where I said if sort of hip hop brought culture to disco, then NFTs brought culture to crypto. Do you think that's a fair statement, or do you think that that's just an NFT bias take from someone like me?
I think it might be somewhere in the middle. I definitely think crypto has and had a culture before NFTs. Like there's a lot of people who would have come in, whether it's like the 2013 cycle or the 2017 cycle, who would have been part of a different flavor of Twitter. And, people would have speculated on things in similar ways, and there would have been status symbols in other ways. I think NFTs bring it to the mainstream in a sort of, in a different way, such that like I would maybe classify it as a different chapter in terms of crypto culture, where you're definitely able to, like form culture in a different way. I think people are visual, right? That's easier to own a sappy seal than it is to own some random number of coins, where all you have is a logo, right? But I think, so something like the Link Marines in the 2018 kind of bear market would be a good example of people forming culture around speculation and, memes and things like this. So it's kind of like yes and would maybe be my answer. Like NFTs definitely bring us to a new level. It's a new form of community formation. People think about spreading images and memes in a different way. But it does kind of build on kind of a crypto tradition of internet culture that's been around since the Satoshi days, I suppose.
Want to talk about Accelerate Art, and obviously your would you call it a partnership with Claire Silver with what you're doing
Yeah.
with Claire? Yeah.
Yeah, so Accelerate Art it's a nonprofit based in New York. Claire and I co-founded that and have been working together for the last sort of 2.5 years. And essentially the main through line is just we want to support emerging artists who are working with this medium, right, with NFTs and digital objects and anything of that sort. So that's the tagline, but happy to go in any direction you want.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to hear like how it came about, and also your time with Tribute Labs as well.
Yeah, totally. So I guess if you rewind back to the beginning of 2021, this is like a few months before things start to pick up with NFTs. I just been spending a lot of time floating around these virtual worlds. As I think I mentioned, like Decentraland was always a curiosity for me. In this case, Crypto Voxels was the one that we chose to work in. But I thought, okay, this metaverse, or before the word metaverse sort of became co-opted, seems interesting, right? Like I feel like we could, see a world where a lot of us will spend time in these virtual environments. And what can you do now, like i.e. back in kind of January 2021? Well, probably not that much, but we could do art stuff. And so essentially, like I bought some land in Crypto Voxels, found Claire on Twitter. She had, I think, maybe 200 followers or so, like 300 followers. This is before her art career had kind of taken off, and just felt like I vibed with her style and her approach. And I mean, she was back then very similar to who she is now. I just think with less eyeballs on her. And so just asked, if she would be open to kind of curating and doing some of the art side of this. And long story short, we did that. And we did, I think, 6 shows in Crypto Voxels where we would have audio on Clubhouse, because this is before Twitter Spaces, and then be walking around in these little virtual environments together, and interviewing the artists kind of live with people tuning in. And so it was kind of like a social experience around digital art. And I don't want to, like there are definitely other people who are working on similar things, but I do think it was a cool like flag to plant at the beginning of that movement to say, hey, like these things are art. You mentioned Justin Aversano, like he was in our first show, for example. A lot of these different artists who are still around today, like we got to know them quite early. And it's just it was such a fun kind of opening sequence there that we thought, okay, how do we continue this in a light touch way that people enjoy? And, we shifted kind of to formalize it as a nonprofit and, onward and upward from there. But that's a bit of the backstory.
Yep. Let's switch gears to back to chaotic generalists. I just love that term. You've obviously started this blog. You're very deep in the space. You've been here for a couple of years now. It probably feels like an eternity. What would your advice be to the listeners out there? I mean, it's hard, right? There's no silver bullet, but in your mind, like, what are some tactics or some theories that you have to sort of keep yourself sane, so that you can treat this Web3 journey as a marathon and not a sprint?
It's a great question. I think, I guess two thoughts come to mind. One, you have to do it wrong first to understand your boundary limits, probably, where I think most people who've been around would say, hey, like I was overdoing it at some point, right? Addicted to my phone or on the internet too much and not sleeping as much as I should and all that. And I think like when you go through that experience, you realize, okay, well, there's clearly something here that I'm excited about. So I want to make sure that I'm here for the long haul. How do I do that? Well, I need some sort of life balance. And so for me, that ends up looking like, you need good friends. The find your tribe thing might be a tired comment, but I do think there's a lot of value in whether it's one, group of people or a few small groups of people that you're able to like experience the industry with. That's super key. So you're able to, kind of combat the loneliness and have people to hold you accountable to taking some time off sometimes, things like that. So finding your people is key. And then I think it's just like honestly confronting this idea of if I want to be part of this, I know I need to have some life balance. So you need to be able to do things outside of crypto. As much as that can be challenging, if a lot of the time people who are in this industry find their professional lives and their personal lives and their sort of interests all wrapping up in one space, it can be quite overwhelming. So just, the encouragement to find your people, and make some relationships, and then an encouragement to find something that's like completely different and outside of crypto. Even just a little bit of that can go a long way.
When you sit around a dinner table or going to an event with a few of your normie friends, how do you explain what you do to them?
It's a great question. I often lead with, I'm not a great dinner party guest, because it ends up being quite a complicated conversation. I think at a high level, I try and talk about crypto as a subcategory of tech broadly, right? Where it's just essentially this idea of, blockchains introduce a new form of servers and now you can own things on the internet, right? Where previously, like I could send Greg, and we'll use Jameson as a third point here, Greg and Jameson, the same Taylor Swift song. Now all of us own that same MP3 together. Like now all of a sudden we've invented a way where definitively, Jameson has the song and Greg and I don't, right? And so there's this idea of like, well, humans like to collect and own things. Wouldn't it seem natural that that would also happen on the internet? And usually like that as a general point tends to work, but often you're adjusting a little bit to who the person is, right? Like if someone's working in music, that might specifically resonate. If someone's a teacher, it's like, maybe, okay, I need to figure out a different model here. So a lot of it ends up being like, how do you humanize what we're doing, contextualize it a bit in like the light of technology, or like tech in general, and then also root it a little bit in the person that you're talking to, right? Like if it's an athlete, you can talk about, fan relationships and community building and how that, already happens over the internet. And this is just a different technical layer underneath those kind of activities. But those are some quick points.
I think it's a wonderful way to frame it. And you obviously know Jameson quite well, because we both know that he's a massive Taylor Swift fan. And, Renee has definitely backed me up on that one. I think that she got him concert tickets last time.
Love to see
Taylor
it.
Swift was out here in Australia. So shout out to Jameson, and hope you're bumping the Taylor Swift tunes here on a Friday in Australia. All right, as we start to wrap up the show, there's been an awesome conversation, Ben, but I do want to go back into sort of NFT land in terms of what's in our wallet, favorite NFTs, what might be on your shopping list. I'm going to start with, what is the favorite NFT that you hold?
Yeah, I think maybe unsurprisingly to people who know me, I'm going to answer with my Chromie Squiggle, would be the favorite like single NFT that I hold. I don't know. I feel like at one level, it's one of the earlier NFTs that I was able to collect in 2021. So there's like some sentimentality around that. And, I've had it as my PFP for a few years. So you kind of attach personal brand to it. So it's like the one thing that I know, assuming I'd be okay financially, that I wouldn't want to sell. But it's also like representative of a lot of things that I just like about the crypto space, right? Like it kind of represents creator empowerment and like, a sense of mischief and life being kind of playful, this sense of like digital property rights. And, a lot of the things that interest me generally about NFTs kind of loop back into the squiggle symbolically. So it's got to be my squiggle.
So I'm going to give the listeners my answer that I probably haven't talked about this too much, maybe not in recent times anyway, but I was very lucky actually, Ben, well, besides the Heart You emote that I've got behind me here on the physical, which was the first ever mint that I did on Async Art in January 2022. So that was actually a proof
Cool.
collaboration. It was the first collaboration that Kevin organized, just like a small sort of collaboration on the side. But I remember I was actually watching Ash Barty, the tennis player, win the Australian Open. It was the middle of summer here in Australia, and I was minting it on the couch while I watched Ash Barty win this historical, tournament.
Love it.
And this emote right here that actually says, like, on the bottom right-hand corner that I'm looking at, it says anarchy against the FUD. And on the left-hand side, it says forever in love with myself. Now, I know that can sound like a very, very cringe statement to many people, but I'm also a big believer too that if you're not in love with yourself, or if you're not sort of if you can't love yourself, it's going to be hard to put love out into the world. So that thing spoke to me immediately, and I have developed quite a good relationship with Heart You as well. I'm not minted, but I bought an early Moonbird, the one that I use on Twitter, and the hard eyes, and that was actually to pay homage to Heart You and the relationship that Heart You had with Proof. So that one speaks to me a lot. The floor's not overly high on that, but it's not really about the floor for me on that particular one. It just has this almost like sentimental value to me. But the other one I wanted to mention is I got very, very lucky in Grails #1, and I minted the protoglyph for 0.05 ETH.
Very cool.
So Grails was obviously one of Kevin's sort of nutty professor projects that, particularly in the first couple of seasons, has really, for all the FUD that Moonbirds gets at time, Grails has been a wonderful experiment. And the backstory on that was I was tossing up between what I thought was going to be maybe a Snowfro piece that ended up being Ixshells. And I was tossing up what ended up being the protoglyph. Now, I had no idea it was Lava Labs. I had no idea it was protoglyph. And I was down to the last two. I had an hour to mint. It was on a Friday afternoon. And then I got a text from someone or in a group chat, and they said, hey, because DC Investor had a proof pass, and he minted the protoglyph. And the first ever, I actually tweeted about this yesterday when DC Investor sort of went into bat for Kevin Rose a little bit and just sort of felt like everything was maybe a little bit too much right now in terms of the heat that Kevin's copying. And I remember that first ever episode of Modern Finance that DC Investor was on with Kevin. And that was a massive unlock for me with NFTs. Like, I had gone down the rabbit hole in the previous few months, but that particular episode was a massive unlock. It also came out on my birthday. So I had felt like all these stars were aligning. I'm like, literally my decision was like, I'm down to two. I like the art of both of them. I'm just going to roll with what DC did because I feel like he's had some form of like formative shape of like how I got into this space. And then that reveal, it was a Sunday morning here in Australia in March 2022, was the best 90 minutes I've ever had in NFTs. And yes, minting the protoglyph was part of it, but the video that Kevin, and I'm afraid to say his name because everyone, I'm going to trigger a few people, but Ryan Carson, the video that those two did and the reveal and the quality of artists that you had, Tyler Hobbs, Dimitri Cherniak that was in it. Obviously Lava Labs, there was so many others that I'm forgetting. Like Gary V had one, Tim Ferriss, like the whole works of that first wave. But I remember they were down to the last two, and the last two ended up being Tyler Hobbs as The Wall and then the protoglyph. And so I'm down to the last two, and I just sort of, the Discord was popping off and everyone's like, Tyler Hobbs is going to be one of the last two. Tyler Hobbs is going to be one of the last two. And Kevin's like, number 19 is, and this, so the protoglyph was number 11, is Tyler Hobbs. And I was like, oh, and my heart just sunk because I was like, man, I wanted a Tyler Hobbs so bad. And so a minute later, he's like, but you wouldn't think we would leave just with some type of like, unenergetic ending. Number 11. You may have heard of a thing called autoglyphs. Well, before the autoglyphs, there was actually a prototype called the protoglyph by Lava Labs. And, I was just like in euphoria land, and there was only 77 minted. And I mean, one went for 80 ETH almost immediately. We haven't seen a sale sort of since that high, but I really love the art, and I love the fact that like it's Lava Labs. Yes, it's not an autoglyph, but the fact that there's only 77 of them, and then within about 20 minutes, I went on to ENS domains and got protoglyph.eth just to accompany that to
Nice.
for a future, maybe for a future sale down the track. So the protoglyph is definitely one that I like knowing that is in the bag. So
Totally. It's super cool. I just want to interject and say I always love hearing people's personal stories associated with these NFTs. So yeah, thanks for that. Those are a great pair of stories.
appreciate it, Ben. Appreciate it. I thought that maybe you would like that one. Sometimes I tell people like, shut the hell up. They don't care. All right. As we wrap up, I don't want to keep you too long, Ben, because I know you've got other media commitments, including a Twitter Spaces with War Daddy Capital in 2 hours. So I don't know if this show will be posted by then, but you'll be able to see the recording if you go onto Ben's Twitter, I'm sure. Last two questions, Ben, for you. Anything on your shopping list, your NFT shopping list that you're sort of just keeping a little bit of an eye on that, maybe if floors got to a certain price that you'd be looking at?
Yeah, I think I have a few different art blocks sets and some also FX hash sets that I've got my eyes on, where I think depending on kind of where we are in a hype cycle, the main, really well-known stuff tends to get collected or pop. And, we saw a big Fidenza sale at Sotheby's a few weeks ago. And I think that kind of kicked off a lot of generative art interest. But there's a few art blocks collections that I'm looking at. Someone recently tweeted like, basically you should pay attention to the NFT sets that haunt you in a good way. Like that sense of, like, I really wish I could have one of those if I could. And so I think like something that I don't own that maybe depending on how the floor goes one day I could consider owning is an Azuki. I feel like as far as PFPs go, that artist really kind of set the high watermark for what you can do with like a 10K collection. So we'll see. I'm not sure if I'll get a chance to do that. They're quite expensive, but those would be some answers.
Yeah, and shout out to Azuki. I had a couple of friends that they did sell during that Zagabond FUD, I should say, when it sort of, I think it got down as low as 6 ETH. And it's really held up, as we've sort of mentioned, some of those other projects that have held up in the last couple of months. So Azuki's a good one. I love the way that you framed, you should think about collections that kind of haunt you. And what haunts me every day is squiggles, Ben. So
That's the right answer, Greg.
I've been looking at squiggles for a long, long time. I probably was nearly going to pull the pin at 5 ETH, sort of halfway through the end of last year, maybe around that August period or something like that. But I had gone through, similar to your advice earlier and like how you navigate this space. That was my first crypto down cycle in sort of May and June. And I was actually in the US for most of it at VCon and NFT NYC and Consensus, and it was just like, it was killing me and I didn't know what to do. I was a deer in headlights, but you take your learnings, right? You sort of pick up the pieces, you take your learnings. So I was a little bit gun shy when I came back in the back half of last year because I just felt like I lost this extraordinary amount of like paper wealth at least. And so I didn't pull the pin on squiggles. And then squiggles, I felt like at least in the last couple of months, the resistance was like 8.5. And I thought, maybe I can go 8. I'll trim a few other NFTs and I'll go 8. And then we saw the run up, right? And I mean, it's still not unattainable for me, but yeah, squiggles for me constantly haunts me. I am definitely going to get one in the bag at some point. And I am going to read your blog as well about squiggles because I want to go down the rabbit hole because I feel like it is one of those collections that, in a blur era where we see a lot of just who cares, it's just everything's floor. Squiggles is one of those ones with the aesthetics that you want to really get something that you like.
Totally. Yeah, I'd love to hear it, man.
Yeah. All right. Last question for you. And this is definitely not financial advice. This is just, we'll frame this question as, are there any projects, let's call it under 0.5 ETH right now, Ben, that, as you scroll down, maybe OpenSea, you go, that looks like an interesting project for, anywhere between 0 and 0.05. Oh, sorry, I should say 0.5.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this just scrolling around, and I have an answer that might not be yeah, common for most folks. But I would say Drip Drop by Dave Krugman is a set of 1,000 or so photos of kind of raindrops. And it's in a way like this intersection of photography and generative art in a sense. Like Dave's a super thoughtful guy. I've had a chance to interview him before. It's one of those artists who, will, quote unquote, be around for a long time. And it's quite thoughtful. And sometimes like things like that to sort of leak out of the hype cycle and don't go just don't get into the spotlight as much as they maybe should. And so I'm not sure exactly what the floor is. Let me check quickly. Yeah, it looks like 0.35. So that fits in your range. That would be kind of something I think would be interesting. And it really is more like you are in it for the art and you think this is like a long-term, interesting person and play. I'm not sure it's going to pump on Blur, if you know what I mean, over the next week or so. But I think that's the kind of meaningful stuff that I'm looking to collect in that range.
Yeah, so I'm going to say little pudgies. I don't know if this is necessarily a long-term hold, but I've been really impressed by Luca and what he's doing with the Pudgy Penguins ecosystem. And if I think about when, if the traditional set of pudgies, the 10K collection, continues to pump, we have seen companion drops that will, follow it. It's sort of like, what's that spread going to be? Is it going to be sort of around what Bored Apes have Bored Apes have always been sort of around that 4 to 5 to 1 for a mutant ape. Obviously we've seen the gap close. Unfortunately, it pains me to say with the Proof Pass and Moonbirds, that used to be about 5 or 6 to 1. That's closed to about 3 to 1. But I think Little Pudgies might be an interesting one at 0.4. And then the other one is on the left-hand side of my shoulder here. In full disclosure, I don't have any Little Pudgies, but I have about 10 crypto artes. I have a great relationship with Seb, the artist there. And I think that one of the early generative art projects on Ethereum from 2018, I just love it that it visually documents the traffic that was happening on the Ethereum blockchain through art. And I just think that that's a really fascinating art project. So they're probably the two for me, Ben.
Very cool.
Awesome. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I will get our regular disclaimer out of the way. This show is not financial. Nothing on this show, I should say, is financial advice. This show is for educational and informational purposes only. Thank you so much to our listeners to tuning in for episode 39. I think we've been in for a real treat speaking to Ben. I actually can't wait to re-watch this show, Ben, because I think you had some incredibly balanced takes and advice for people in the space, and I can see why you're so sought after across many different projects. And hopefully we could do this again in the future sometime.
Amazing. Thanks so much for having me, Greg. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay. Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, take care.